In 2016, BMW launched the M2. At the time it generated a lot of excitement as it was often referred to as the reincarnation of the legendary BMW E30 M3. It's a short wheelbase, wide arched, rear wheel drive M car that appeared to focus more on the driver rather than be the M car that could do it all. It seemed to be the perfect choice for an M car at the time, but was it really? Many owners complained about the lack of direction in the steering, the lack of enthusiasm in the brakes, and not to forget the unbalanced power delivery. Combined, these complaints seem quite major for a driver's car, with some saying it does not deserve the M badge at all. So, in order to keep their clients happy, BMW launched the M2 competition in 2019. The comp featured a slightly new front face, new wheels, and most noticeably the S55 engine from the BMW M3 and M4. The M2 comp wasn't just a facelift, it was a completely new car in the lineup and one that promised to have fixed all the issues of the original M2. At the time, the original M2 was still available to purchase, although now you can't buy either. The BMW M2 has a 3-litre straight 6 producing 364 brake horsepower. It will do 0 to 60 in 4.4 seconds and onto a top speed of 171 miles an hour. The M2 competition has a different 3-litre straight 6, being the S55 engine which produces 410 brake horsepower. It will do 0 to 60 in 4 seconds and onto a top speed of 174 miles an hour, with the optional M Drivers package. Anyways, going back to the original M2, with the car market prices going crazy at the moment, you can still pick up a respectable example for under £28,000 in both manual and DCT, which is excellent value for money. So is it worth it? And is the difference between the comp big enough that you should avoid the M2? Well, let's find out. So welcome back to another episode of Cars with Jay. Today I am looking at the BMW M2 because this car, you can have it for £25,000 now, and I think it's really good value for money because when it first came out in 2016, this car was about £44,000, and immediately they went for overs for a good period of time because people thought that, oh look, this is like the E30 reincarnation. You know, this car is something completely new. It's a manual gearbox, it's a short wheelbase, it's just better than the M3 and M4 from a driver's perspective. You know, someone who just wants to go out by themselves, is usually by themselves in the car, wants something a bit more nimble. And it was definitely a step up from the M240 that was available in the 2 Series range. So this car had high expectations, but after a good couple of years I started to read a lot about how people were disappointed with this car. It was things like the brakes, the mapping. People said it used to snap on you way too easily. It just wasn't linear in its throttle response, and the suspension and ride and steering could have been improved. And that's a lot of comments. That's almost to make this car almost redundant in the lineup. But the fact that this car is now 20 grand cheaper than your average M2 competition, I think it's still worth a consideration. So I'm here today to tell you, what are you missing out on exactly when you get this car over an M2 competition? Now, of course, this car is a manual gearbox. It's not a DCT like the M2 competition that we have today. The fact that this car is manual adds a bit of enjoyment to this. I've driven a DCT before, a standard M2 like this, and it was boring. Like, it did everything that you wanted it to do, and it felt like the car was driving itself. It didn't want me to be there. A lot of these country roads tend to have like nice open straights, and it just wasn't as engaging having the DCT gearbox option. So I'm glad today we actually have the manual because it brings a new element to it. A lot of people that I've spoken to with an M2 competition have preferred it with the DCT gearbox. It is the S55 engine and it apparently just suits it better, but we'll find out today. With this has the M55 single but dual scroll turbo, and it is a different engine. This engine was introduced in 2009 and is available in your 335i's, basically anything with a 3.5 at the end of it. But this is obviously a heavily tuned N55 from factory, so there's the element of balance that you get with having a factory tuned engine. This car itself is not actually factory tuned anymore. This actually is a lot more powerful. The intercooler's been done, the intake's been done, and the exhaust has been modified slightly. I think the downpipes have been done. And now what we have is a 415 brake horsepower BMW M2, which is powerful enough in theory to keep up with an M2 competition. Yes, we've got a manual gearbox, so we're going to be a bit slower in the changes, but the engagement is going to be fully there. And from what the owner Steve was saying, the snappiness has been mapped out, so the car is a bit more fun to drive, and actually the power is quite usable. It's so engaging with this manual box. Oh wow, this is nice. This is really nice. Let's see what the downshifts are like. Oh, effortless. Look at that, on the power, and you can hear the turbo spooling up. Wow. Just unreal. Unreal. A lot of people have said that they do prefer the engine in this to the S55 in the M2 competition because it sounds amazing, but they say it's just not powerful enough. But this is 415 brake horsepower. It's pretty much more powerful than a stock M2 competition. It would be erroneous of me if I did not give praise to the N55 engine. After all, it's one of BMW's most legendary engines, spanning across various models and often proving the most versatile petrol engine they've made to date. The M55 loves to rev and makes that infamous snarling metallic noise that we all know and love from old BMWs. But this isn't just an ordinary M55. It has a new intake, a forged crankshaft, forged connecting rods, newer piston rings, and its spray-on cylinder liners replaced with cast iron ones to reduce engine failure. It's also received a reshaped oil pan, a new oil drain pump for better circulation, and additional oil coolers. The original M55 could easily run this power, but the M2 had to be reliable, so the changes had to be made. In terms of common problems, these are the only things to look out for when getting a car with an N55 engine: valve cover oil leak, water pump failure, leaking oil filter housing, and van of solenoid failure. These are four of the main problems that you will likely face. Anyways, let's get back to the car and let's see how Sport Plus affects the driving. Now we're going to enjoy this drive in Sport Plus because this is the driving mode that got the most complaints, the one that was the most unbalanced, the one that was the most unpredictable. So let's see if this, with a stage 2 map, has actually really affected the way this car drives. So the traction's eased off. Throttle response is opened up massively. It's very, very sensitive to the throttle. It's 18.5 degrees today, so the Michelin Pilot Sport 4Ss that are on this car are gripping so well. I've got traction eased off, 415 horsepower, and the car is not breaking traction. Now obviously I can encourage it a little bit more, but I think this is a good indicator to someone who just wants to go for a spirited drive in Sport Plus, to not have like the back end breaking out on you and making you feel like you can't enjoy the car without having an accident. Steering's not as precise as I want it to be, even in Sport Plus. It still feels very light, almost like it's in comfort mode, but the throttle response is very, very good. It's opened up a lot and there's so much dynamic range to that throttle. I feel like I've got so much control. The gearbox is still not an issue. Do I have DCT? Do I not? It just doesn't make any difference whatsoever. And I just don't think that I'm having any issues in that department. The clutch feels so good. It's not heavy like a Porsche. It's quite light, which is not a bad thing because it still feels engaging. It's got a good throw to it. And I think the biting point isn't actually that low down. It's reasonable. So you can make good use of the full range of the clutch as well. So it's got a lot going for it, this car. And apart from the interior details like the MBT sat-nav of the previous generation without its touchscreen, which touchscreen is a bit of a gimmick, and the LCI lights, the front and rear, and the subtle design changes, for 20 grand less, you're not exactly getting cheated of a nice car. You're getting a fantastic car. But we have yet to drive the M2 competition yet, so let's see exactly what that gives us that this doesn't, or if anything, what improvements, I say in air quotations, have been made. So the M2 exceeded my expectations. It's a very fun car with a manual gearbox, however the handling does let it down. Let's see how the M2 competition fares, and is it worth £20,000 more? Oh wow, already you feel the steering is just so much more direct. It's not that it's like any heavier, it's just, it feels quicker, like it's got a quick rack on it. It's just so planted, the front end. And I'm not even going more than 30 miles an hour. Okay, I'm going 40 miles an hour in this speed zone, but the front end is so planted. It feels really direct, like really direct, in a very, very good way, not in like a 20 grand extra way, like in a, this is a definite improvement over the original M2. The brakes feel a lot firmer as well. So get into a decent road and we'll open it up some more. I'm going to put this into M1 mode.
I should probably explain quickly here that the M1 and M2 buttons on the M car steering wheels is user configurable. So that means that M1 and M2 can be programmed to be whatever you want them to. In this case, M1 is manual. I didn't clarify that in my M4 video and a lot of people called me up on that. So I'd just like to clarify it in this video.
It's basically manual and how this car should be driven. So we're going to just drop it into third. Already the pickup is just insane, and that DCT changes are just ferociously fast. It just feels so agile, it's just unreal. Just powered through that corner right there and it felt like a four-wheel drive car. The front just picked up and just carried me round. It's just, wow. You know what, every single review I watched of the M2 competition and the way they said it just fixed all the little problems with the M2, it's right, it's so weird. It's, until you drive it, you don't fully appreciate what they've done. I mean, on paper, it just doesn't look like much with the M2 comp, but holy shit, this is just unreal, absolutely unreal. Oh, a little back end twitch there. This thing covers ground. It feels so much quicker than that M2 despite theoretically having less horsepower. That is weird. That is a weird feeling, but a lot of it comes from that DCT gearbox because it's just so precise and sharp. The throttle range feels really weird. It feels like I've got a bit more down at the bottom end, whereas the M2 original one had so much more linearity with the throttle. But this car feels so planted, so poised and composed. I can see why people don't opt for a manual in this. It just, the DCT adds an extra layer of involvement, which sounds weird because you think the manual would, but it's just a different type of manual experience. I feel more responsible to keep this car in the right gear than being in a manual, because usually in a manual, when you're on a twisty, tight road, you'll usually keep it within 1 or 2 gears and you'll just back off rather than changing up into the next gear because you'll find that it's a bit pointless. Whereas in this, you've got no excuse. You can't say you don't need to do that because the gear changes are so quick, you can flick through them and be as optimum as possible. So definitely adds a layer of experience to the car that I do enjoy. But this thing is definite improvement. 20 grand extra improvement? No. I wouldn't spend the extra money on this if you had to stretch yourself. Realistically, like, it's not worth it. The original M2 is good enough. I still had fun on that. You saw why the smile on my face. But this is definitely an improvement.
So now that we know what they're like to drive, let's talk about the running cost. If you wanted to replace the tyres, you're looking at £750 for a whole set and £450 for the rears. If you wanted to replace the brakes, you're looking at £1150 for the whole set and £200 just for the pads. High temp brake fluid is absolutely recommended and will set you back £20. As for servicing, you should expect it to be around a couple of £100 from your local BMW dealership. MPG is around 20 miles per gallon and a full tank will get you 200 miles with some headroom due to the relatively small 52 litre tank. Now, I thought I'd touch on the interiors of both the cars because Obviously, being based off the 2 Series, the interiors are going to be very similar. However, the M2 Competition features new bucket seats, which for me personally are way more comfortable than the seats offered in the M2. Now, the only other differences are the iDrive system being the newer version in the M2 Competition with the touchscreen, and other than that there isn't really much difference. So if you're buying the cars for the interior, don't worry about it too much. And overall, they're a really nice place to be. The sound system's great, the infotainment system is usable, the steering wheel is of nice size, and it's very comfortable to use. So that concludes this episode of Cars with Jay. If you like this episode, please hit the like button, and if you want to see more from my channel, please subscribe.